Hello, everybody. Can you hear me out there? I'm just sorting out the fact that I managed to do some sort of technical screw up on the first live stream, so we are hopping over here onto another one. Either that or I'm being secretly undermined by Keir Starmer's crack squad of dissident hunters. He's out there trying to successfully actually force the remaining anti-war Labour MPs to reverse their pledge to oppose British government policy over Ukraine. But I'll come to that more later. Hello, Shadowbound Refugee, who I was on a very interesting stream with over on Franco's channel. And hello to Chris Maker and Robert Aston, Irish Partisan. Hello to our friend over there in Belarus. And President Jesus, it's a great honor, sir. First question of the night. I wonder if Alex saw Crystal and Saga fall on their knees against a really impressive servitude. It's always really impressive servitude. I love watching that show because what I love seeing is two absolute idiots repeat watered down versions of Jacobin articles from 6 months earlier. And it's going to be, always going to be good when those two have something to say. The only thing better is the incredibly awkward show that Crystal Ball does with Kyle Kalinske, where Kyle Kalinske struggles to keep his trousers on. That's always fun. Hello to Jonathan. Hello to Oz Whistles. Right, seeing as we're gathering here, let's get into it. So I'm back on the live streams again due to the fact that situation changed. Got a faster internet connection, so now I can hopefully speak to you without various police agencies shutting me down quite as easily. That is a joke, but not really. So we've all seen the footage, I suppose, the dramatic escalation in Ukraine following months is incorrect, years of boiling tension on the border of the disputed Russian-speaking regions of eastern Ukraine between the Maidan imposed regime in Kiev and the separatist movement there that want to declare independence or become part of Russia. At the moment, it's declare independence. And after 8 years now of this rumbling on and on and on, it finally reached a head this week with a direct Russian intervention. So what I want to do here really is just explain, really start with the background and then work our way upwards, so to speak. And I'm doing that because not only is the coverage of the Ukrainian events from the bourgeois media so phenomenally idiotic, and I'll come to some of the more egregious examples of that later, and the coverage of from most of the so-called left press is a mess, and an odd mixture of pacifism and opportunism. But I'll get later on to Paul Mason's pro-Azov battalion rally later on. And so where should we start? Let's start by looking at the state of Ukraine itself. And in this, I'm going to draw on the lessons from the collapse of the post-Soviet collapse of the Ukrainian state in the post-Soviet era, the formation of the new Ukrainian state, and what all that means. So, as I posted on Twitter the other day, and as I'm fond of repeating, in the initial referendum towards the very end of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian population did at one stage vote to remain in a reformed USSR. And of course, that was completely overridden by Yeltsin and his counter-revolutionary clique, who were hell-bent on breaking the thing up and then essentially proceeding to loot what was left, unleashing the wave of destruction within Russia that marked the history of that country in the 1990s. Ukraine, of course, goes through a similar process. Ukraine, under the days of the USSR, as actually Putin himself said in one of his speeches, used to be a real high-tech manufacturing hub covering things such as nuclear technology and aerospace. But partly because the Soviet economy was one integrated whole almost, with various sections of it doing very specific things. A switch over to capitalism was never going to be easy, and it wasn't successful because the people who were carrying it out weren't at all interested in actually building anything. They were interested in looting the state assets that were there and banking the proceeds. And that is what has happened with Ukraine, is what has happened with many of the ex-Soviet states, and continue to happen all the way through to the current crisis. The Ukrainian capitalists remained essentially interested in just looting the place. There was no new development of any industry. They did make some money in the 2000s off gas sales to Europe, but that brief flurry of growth ended with the 2008 world recession and all the problems that flowed out of that. And then, of course, we get the ongoing instability in Ukraine and tensions between the various different oligarchs. Hello to Massimiliano Urbani. Good evening, sir or madam or both. The way in which the Ukrainian state was structured produced problems because it fell out of the USSR in a way that no one ever considered that it would, with borders that were always disputed, with various sections added to it and taken away from it over the years. Again, Putin went into this at great depth and detail in both his speeches, and it's a valid point because the borders of Ukraine have been subject to repeated revisions under the strains of the First World War, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and then Kaiser's German Empire, the formation of the Soviet Union, the formation of Soviet Ukraine, the traumatic events and mass slaughter of World War II, the end of World War II, all of this produced changes on its border. And that's all valid historical points because there's a lot of people who are certainly in the capitalist press who are dead set on ignoring all of that. And all of that is important background information when you consider what happened in 2014. But we're not quite there yet. We're still in the history. So you get this state that is broken away from the former USSR, that is run by this kleptocracy, divided between kleptocrats who are mainly oriented towards the West and kleptocrats who are mainly oriented towards Moscow and the East. This isn't particularly palatable choice. Certainly, none of these people ever wanted to do much for the Ukrainian working class. And the political disputes between them were, of course, manipulated and exploited by external actors, mainly the United States, who were very keen to get their series of color revolutions off the ground. One of the earliest ones, of course, was the so-called Orange Revolution that took place in Ukraine in 2004. And that was, of course, over a disputed presidential election, eventually led to a somewhat compromised and squalid bargain between a series of contending oligarchs. And the result of that was nothing was fundamentally altered in the contradictions of Ukraine. The various different oligarchs kept squabbling with each other, having different turns in power, locking each other up. The figures that I remember from the time back in 2004 were people like, of course, the later overthrown president Yanukovych, Viktor Yushchenko, Yulia Tymoshenko, all these characters floating around and holding various offices of state at various times, none of them any better than each other. And again, 10 years after the so-called Orange Revolution, which has been proven by a lot of independent research now to have had extensive involvement from our old friends in the CIA front group, and, like the National Endowment for Democracy, and outright CIA MI6 involvement as well, following a strategy that was applied across the world by the United States in the 1990s. That is what Dick Cheney and his friends used to call full spectrum dominance, which was foreshadowed in George H.W. Bush's New World Order speech back in the early 1990s, where, of course, the Soviet Union had collapsed under the weight of the counter-revolution there. And H.W. Bush was being rather triumphalist and announcing a doctrine that would really mark American foreign policy for the next 30 years, which was the idea that the US could go anywhere, intervene anywhere, do anything, change any regime. And they did this in the 1990s with Yugoslavia. And if you've not read the book by Michael Parenti on this, it is a very much an eye-opening piece of history. Just to give you one small detail, the breakup of Yugoslavia was identified as a priority by the Reagan administration as early as 1984. And that was in a National Security Council directive from 1984, and it's one that they followed through on. The actions of the American administration towards the end of the 90s, denying the Federal Republic government of Yugoslavia any additional bailout funds when it had run into severe financial difficulties thanks to loans being taken out in the 60s, which were then suddenly demanded with a lot of interest in the 80s, and a series of other economic difficulties that all of the Eastern Bloc economies were experiencing in the 1980s. The Americans and the British were absolutely determined to see the every last remnant of the old planned economies of the East absolutely destroyed. It didn't matter how little remained; it had to go. And this Yugoslavia is one more case of that. It found a non-aligned role under Tito. None of his successors were able to measure up to, shall we say, his skill or the level of authority that he brought to governing the country, or at least being the head of state of the country. And the political difficulties facing them, they were unable to resolve. And US and British chose to exploit those contradictions by doing what they have done over and over again everywhere else, which is throwing their weight in terms of money, in terms of political support, in terms of arms, behind the most radical nationalistic reactionary factions they could possibly find. This is a familiar story because this is what they have always done. It's their go-to move for creating a divided, weak, and in this case, quite literally balkanized countries. And they certainly did this when they were backing the far-right groups in Croatia. They were doing this when they were bringing in Osama bin Laden's friends to fight in Bosnia. And all of this at the time was dismissed as Serb propaganda, far-right conspiracies. Is it sounding familiar yet? But it's all been documented. It has all been proved. They did the same in Kosovo again via the KLA when they launched a 2-month bombing campaign against what was left of Yugoslavia when it had already been partially dismembered. In response to a conflict between the KLA and the Serbian paramilitary police forces and Yugoslav National Army in Kosovo. They had to launch an air war because they didn't want to fight a ground war. But they were ultimately successful in pressuring Milosevic with some assistance, it has to be said, from Yeltsin, to give in on that point and give up sovereignty over Kosovo. So they ripped Kosovo out of Serbia, declared it to be independent, and ever since it's become an essential mafia statelet under the protection of the United States. And so I know that most of you watching this stream will probably be fully aware of the fact that with the bleatings of American and British politicians about territorial sovereignty are just complete opportunism. But they should be explained clearly why they are complete opportunism. Territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations means absolutely nothing to the United States. The only rule they have for themselves is that they should be the only ones able to violate territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations. That they are the only ones allowed to do the kind of things they did in Kosovo, the kind of things they did in Iraq later on, and the kind of things they've done in slightly more subtle ways, but no less brutal ways, in places like Syria or Libya. There is no principle at stake here. The only principle is that the United States should be able to do whatever the fuck it likes, whenever the fuck it likes, to act in violent defense of its interests. This is the reality. And so all the bleating and wailing and the rending of garments and the gnashing of the teeth that the liberals, the leftists, the open neocons have all been engaging in over the last few days is all just hypocritical garbage that can be dismissed. these people have shown who they are over and over and over again. So this is some of the background. And I mention this because this is all stuff that Putin himself drew on in both of the speeches that he made in the past week. And he and others said at the time that they would remember what the United States had done to Kosovo and to Serbia, to Yugoslavia. And indeed they have. They've remembered it, and they've remembered that the word of the United States is not to be trusted, that they will always seek to intervene and divide up nations to destroy their enemies in the most reactionary way possible, and to subjugate anybody who doesn't go along with them. And of course they've remembered that. Why wouldn't they? I mean, just because British and American journalists have an attention span as long as a concussed ant doesn't mean that their opponents don't remember. And so when you get the full spectrum dominance doctrine, which is associated mainly with Dick Cheney, but slightly wrongly, he was one of the key movers and shakers in its formulation, but he is just one figure. I mean, in reality, it doesn't belong to the neocons. This is the policy of American imperialism ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. And how could it be otherwise? When your major opponent not only falls, when the whole system of what was used to be referred to as actually existing socialism vanishes, of course, the United States is going to go in there and grab, and its allies at the time, the Germans, the British, the French, are going to go in there and grab as much of that market share as they possibly can and dominate as much of it as they possibly can. And once they've completely destroyed any trace of the old planned economies, then they can asset strip it for as much as they possibly can get away with. And they've all done this. The Germans have done it in the Balkans. The French have been doing it wherever they can get away with it. And the idea that any of them is outside of this is a joke. And the doctrine of full spectrum dominance, of course, became much more noticeable and belligerent during the period of the Bush administration, but the Clinton administration had been following it. It was the Clinton administration that did the interventions in Yugoslavia, that broke away Kosovo from Serbia, that passed the Iraq Liberation Act with the vote of a certain senator from Vermont, old Saint Bernard, who's still distinguishing himself these days by taking the side of his good friend Joe Biden. All of these things led inexorably towards things like the Iraq War, things like the Afghanistan War, the apparently never-ending war on terror, though maybe that'll be replaced now with a war to save the climate. Certainly that's what John Kerry's insane ramblings today seem to suggest. But all of this is the background to what happens in 2014 in Ukraine itself. And of course, by 2014, the occupation of Iraq has gone sideways. The Americans have been exposed as being unable to win in Afghanistan, being unable to eliminate the Taliban, being unable to fully wipe out resistance to them in Iraq. And of course, they engage in the horrendously destructive and brutal war in Libya, which they didn't send ground forces in other than special forces units. They relied on essentially a wave of jihadist mercenaries brought in for them by Erdogan, the Qataris, and various others to do the fighting for them in Libya and to destroy the Libyan state, kill its former leader, Colonel Gaddafi, in a brutal fashion live on camera. And all of this, again, this is noted and remembered by the ruling group in Russia and was brought up by Putin again in his speech, the killing of Gaddafi, the destruction of Libya, etc. But a number of things happen in that late period or mid-period of second-term Obama administration, which makes the events in Ukraine come into sharper focus. One of which is, of course, the failed attempt to remove Bashar al-Assad in Syria, an attempt which mercifully failed given the kind of characters the US was lining up to replace him with. But of course, that did see a direct intervention from the Russian Federation, led again at the time by President Putin, who'd come back in following a brief shuffle out of offices with Medvedev, who privately it was said that Putin blamed Medvedev for not objecting or moving against the American attempt to overthrow Gaddafi, the successful attempt to overthrow Gaddafi. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but certainly he took different action when it came to Syria. when it came to Syria for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because the Russians have a long-term naval base in Syria back to the days of the old Soviet Union, and they do have certain interests in Syria, dependent upon their relationship with the Assad government. And as they had been trying to do for a long time, the Russian government tried to engage in some negotiation with the United States to see that its interests in Syria would be respected. And the United States basically said no. The only thing they had to say was that Assad must go, and there was no talking to anybody about that. And so when ISIS starts to advance upon the Syrian capital, Damascus, when it becomes clear that the Assad government stands a very strong chance of falling without support, of course, the Russians intervene and launch a successful operation to shore up the Assad government, rearm, re-equip, retrain its forces, and use Russian air power to drive back ISIS or some of the other jihadist groups as well, over the objections of the Americans, who didn't quite know what to do, because Barack Obama was painted himself into a corner, trying to maintain the narrative about the war on terror, trying to pretend that he wasn't there to overthrow the Assad government, trying to pretend that they were interested in actually fighting the jihadists in Syria, trying also to counterbalance the glaring contradiction between them carpet bombing the ISIS-held cities in Iraq and then saying that Russia couldn't do the same thing in Syria. All of which was sort of coming together of bullshit narratives, which made the Americans look very stupid. And the Russians were able to exploit that. It should be emphasized, of course, that the Russians tried again and again to negotiate an outcome with the Americans in Syria, and the Americans always refused under Obama. And then, of course, we get to the Trump period. And it's worth going into the Trump period, but I'll first of all, to finish on the 2014 part of this, of course, we get to the period of what's referred to as the Maidan, or the coup, if you will, against Viktor Yanukovych, who is falsely painted in the press accounts of this as just a Kremlin guy. But in actual fact, Yanukovych, being a representative of the Ukrainian oligarchy, was always looking in both directions for some kind of deal. And because the Ukrainian economy was in severe trouble, and he was actually negotiating what would be a deal with the EU. But of course, when he saw the conditions that the EU wanted to put on this, which was like eye-watering cuts in public expenditure, wholesale sell-offs of what remained of the old state-owned enterprises, Yanukovych, being yes, corrupt and an opportunist, but perhaps not politically suicidal, realized that if he engaged in that deal, it would mean huge problems for him politically, because it would be essentially what the EU was demanding was a huge attack on the living standards of the Ukrainian working class. And of course, apparently Yanukovych only found out about this when the Russians translated the deal into Russian and out of English or French or whatever was the original language, realized that it would be suicide for him to sign it and refused to, and sort of deal with Russia. It's at that point his the legitimate frustrations of a lot of Ukrainians about the fact that they were living in a very corrupt, backward state run by this parasitic oligarchy exploded. But when you get this inchoate protest movements that become insurrectionary or semi-insurrectionary, and there is no working class party there to actually take hold of the movement and push it in a firm anti-capitalist direction, then these movements literally power falls into the street, which is that there's enough violence that the state becomes disempowered, but the violence is being directed, in this case, by the only really determined, well-funded and organized element, which was the various ultra-nationalist, fascist, neo-Nazi, banderist elements within Ukraine, all aligned with various different oligarchs. But they were the ones with the most resources, the most motivation, and the most clear political line to take, which gave them the strongest position in that moment in 2014 when Yanukovych's government became increasingly destabilized. Unfortunately, there was no clear working class movement there, which means that the force with the strongest level of organization is going to come out on top. You saw this all the way through the Arab Spring as well, incidentally. You've got these legitimately often very working class uprisings against the likes of Ben Ali in Tunisia or Mubarak in Egypt. And of course, but because there was no working class party there, there was no Leninist party there to actually take this in the correct direction, what you got was an incoherent mess where power did fall into the street, to paraphrase Lenin, but there was no Bolshevik party there to pick it up. So who picked it up in Egypt was initially the Muslim Brotherhood. And then, of course, when they ran into trouble in conflict with the military then picked it up and instituted the Sisi dictatorship in Egypt. And the same is true in Ukraine. Power falls into the street, but who's there to pick it up? It's the chosen men of the United States. And as with a lot of the any other intervention the United States does, they are always relying on the most reactionary, the most dangerous, the most criminal elements in any society in order to carry out their actions. And you can go all the way back to something like the Indonesian coup of 1965 to see this. It's a consistent theme, not just with the Americans, the British, the French all do this as well. They find the most backward reactionary elements in society, the ultra-right-wing religious elements, ultra-right-wing, like semi-feudal elements, criminal gangs, hordes of lumpens, and they organize them into efficient killing machines, which is what the Azov battalion and their friends are in Ukraine. And after that, they literally take the Ukrainian parliament hostage, hold it at gunpoint until it agrees to a new constitution. There is a presidential election, and this guy, Petro Poroshenko, comes in. But of course, then we have the later leaked telephone call of the notorious American ambassador to Ukraine at the time, Victoria Nuland, saying, "We got to appoint this guy Yatsenyuk as the prime minister." And of course, yeah, he later went on to become prime minister. But what's created in Ukraine in 2014 is first of all, the idea that it's a thriving democracy or something is, of course, one for people who believe in fairy stories. So, Paul Mason and others. But what's created is a coup state, which is has its real source of support in a minority of very well armed, very well financed, ultra nationalistic, semi-fascist and full-on fascist militias, who are the real armed strength of this new Maidan regime. And Poroshenko, interesting figure, who previously had been a guy who had extensive dealings with the Russians, had business interests in Russia, had been regarded as a sort of neutral figure with interests everywhere. And he comes in, of course, with this Maidan regime, the fact that it's underpinned by the armed force of these fascistic elements, these fascists do what they always do, which is to engage in a series of pogroms, including most notoriously at the Odessa House of Trade Unions, where a series of people are burned alive following a peaceful protest. No one ever brings that up. Incidentally, none of these people who committed these crimes have ever been found. And again, Putin addressed this in one of his speeches when he said, the people who carried out that crime are known to us and we will find them. Now, this is one of the things that, of course, the Ken doll on the Crystal and Saga show, Saga himself misrepresented and lied about and said there was sort of a mass kill list for Ukraine. No, Putin was referring to something very specific. He was referring to the people who carried out the action against the peaceful protesters in the House of Trade Unions, burning those people alive in one of the most brutal ways to kill someone possible. He was referring to those people, but it's those people who are the real power in Ukraine. And you can tell that because Poroshenko first and then Zelensky both had inclinations to sign some kind of deal to end what became a rebellion in the Eastern Russian-speaking provinces, which, again, if you're not aware, these Eastern provinces were transferred over to the Soviet Ukraine in an arbitrary border decision by Khrushchev. When we interviewed Scott Ritter for the podcast, he was saying that the reason why this was done was to try and secure more seats at the United Nations. Who knows what Khrushchev's reasoning was. But it was an arbitrary decision by Khrushchev, which made very little sense. And of course, these Russian-speaking regions immediately come under attack by these hard rightists, these sort of Stepan Bandera worshippers, and there's a rebellion. There's a rebellion which, at the first in the first period, is only very cautiously supported by Putin. Now, to go into Putin himself, Putin obviously has been around for over 20 years now in the public eye. He's been president for two very long terms. In an intermediate period, he was prime minister. Figure of absolute obsession in the U.S. media, though who he is never really explained. But Putin is a guy who he's a very cautious ruler, and always has been, completely contrary to the reputation that he's given in the fevered imaginations of the media in the United States and Britain. And why is he a cautious ruler? Because, again, like, seems to be, from everything that I've read about him and everything that I've seen him say and do, he's a guy who's, because he was the head of the FSB, because he was an intelligence man, because he came up through the cutthroat world of St. Petersburg machine politics in the 1990s. He's a man who knows very well the strengths and weaknesses of the Russian state. And he knew very well the strengths and weaknesses of Russian capitalism. He seems to understand that, or at least he has people around him who understand that. And so, of course, what he does when he gets into power, immediately after the final resignation of the disgraced, full drunk Boris Yeltsin, is that he sets about securing the foundations of the Russian state, because Putin is operating and will prove to be a very capable leader of Russian capitalism, much more capable than the clownish years of the Yeltsin regime. But of course, when people say, Putin's an authoritarian, and of course, Putin rules in a sort of semi-Bonapartist fashion sometimes, but he inherited his powers, many of them anyway, from the highly Bonapartist, semi-dictatorial constitution that was imposed by Boris Yeltsin at the urging and cheering on of the United States and Britain after Yeltsin's coup against the parliament in 1993, the parliament who had dared Yeltsin's plan of the destruction and asset stripping of Russian state property. And Yeltsin responded with armed force, cheered on, by the way, by everybody at the time in the West, of course, because Yeltsin was their guy. And they thought that Putin was going to be their guy as well. I remember him getting state visits over here, making nice with Tony Blair. And Putin, in his early years, certainly played his hand very cautiously. He made a priority out of, first of all, crushing the life out of the rebellion in Chechnya, which, incidentally, our geographically challenged Foreign Secretary Liz Truss recently all but confirmed that the British MI6 have been involved in trying to stir up trouble in Chechnya. Putin has said this over and over again. Truss was asked about it by, I think, Lavrov at a recent meeting, and says we don't comment on the past, which is as good as confirming that they did it. And this was all the way back in the 1990s, because even when the Americans and the British were proclaiming friendship with their drunk puppet Yeltsin, elements within the military and security agencies in the United States and Britain still saw a unified Russia as potentially developing into some sort of threat, so that the more that they could encourage separatism and the more that they could encourage breakaways, the better they thought it would be for their interests. And that's why they got involved in trying to stir up further rebellions in the Caucasus. And Putin, as the former head of the FSB, knows this very well. He's talked about it on camera over and over again. Again, it's nothing new if you've actually been paying attention to what he said. So after the initial shock of the 9/11 attack and everything like that, and Putin actually, against the wishes of his military guys, offers the United States full cooperation for them to go into Afghanistan. Some might say he was playing long game. And the idea that the United States would actually weaken itself so badly and fall apart in Afghanistan. But he did it because, again, you see this again and again with Putin, an accommodation with the United States, because he's acting who have a need around the former territory of the US, the Tsarist Empire, they have a series of interests that they want the United States to at least respect and bargain with them over. And he makes this concession of allowing Russian military installations to be used for the American invasion of Afghanistan and occupation of Afghanistan, because he's trying to bargain with the George W. Bush administration over things like NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. And of course, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and others had absolutely no interest in bargaining with him over this. And so towards the end of the George W. Bush administration, following the invasion and occupation of Iraq and the whole series of other criminal acts, Putin makes a speech in 2007 where he outlines many of the same things he was to actually outline earlier this week, which is that that the Russian Federation regards the encroachment of NATO as hostile and unacceptable, that they were made, that specific verbal commitments were made by George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker. And this is confirmed in German government archives and in recollections from people like Strobe Talbot, Clinton's Russia guy, that these commitments were made to, the moronic Gorbachev and towards the end period of the Soviet Union. And of course, you can't believe a single damn thing that the US and the British will tell you. They'll betray you as soon as look at you. But these commitments were made, and the long history of this simmering conflict, which is now exploded, is in the Russians trying to reach an accommodation with the Americans, where there will be some kind of negotiation. There will be some kind of neutral territory kept between expansion and the territory of the Russian Federation. And it's always the same answer, which is it's either ignored or it's disregarded. And Putin himself actually said recently that he asked Bill Clinton in 1999 or 2000, actually, in Clinton's last year, well, why can't Russia join NATO? And Clinton just did his usual slimy thing and sort of slipping away from the question. And it's an interesting question because I can actually remember in about 1999, this thing did come up even on the BBC, the idea that, well, maybe Russia joins NATO. And of course, it was sort of quietly pushed into the background. But why not? Because the people who actually make serious policy decisions inside the White House knew and understood very well that a country the size of Russia, with all the vast natural resources that it has, with all of its potential strength, is not going to be able to remain bound in a military alliance with the United States, when the whole purpose of that military alliance is to keep US dominance inside Europe, certainly, and to be directed against potential enemies and competitors of the United States, of which Russia, when it ceased to be a basket case, would be one. And the Americans, the American officials who really make these decisions, or at least tell the president to make these decisions, they understood that question, that Russia was simply too big, potentially too powerful, to be contained in a military alliance, the whole purpose of which is securing American dominance and furthering American dominance. And so, of course, Russia was never going to be allowed into it. The whole question of this NATO membership is really a question of those who sign up essentially to be in the American capitalist bloc, the American-led imperialist bloc, which is what it has always been. And so, of course, they weren't going to allow Russia into it any more than they would allow the Chinese into it. And of course, this was going to present a problem. It was going to present a problem for the United States eventually, when the Russian capitalist class had got what they wanted out of the chaotic period in the 1990s with the destruction of the planned economy, the privatization of huge amounts of state assets, the enrichment of this foul and parasitic layer of capitalists and just straight up thieves, many of whom, of course, were welcomed with open arms by the British government here in London to buy up some property, buy a football club or two, and just spread money around, including buying a £100,000 tennis match with Boris Johnson. None of this they had a problem with. The problem started emerging when the Russian capitalist class and the state had stabilized, and this is what the Putin years are about, the stabilization of the state, the stabilization of the economy, to the point where the Russian state is no longer easy prey for anybody, where it's not going to break apart easily, where the writ of Moscow now runs firmly all the way across the country. And as soon as that is the case, then that presents a problem. And it presents a problem for the United States, because we come back to what I was talking about earlier on, which is the idea and the reality of full spectrum dominance. Full spectrum dominance not just being an idea that Dick Cheney pulled out of his arse. It's a reflection of a need of the United States as the premier, and indeed in the 1990s, the only superpower, the only global imperialist power that was truly capable of projecting itself anywhere it wanted. Capitalism always has a need to expand. It abhors a barrier. This is what creates imperialism in the first place. It cannot be held back. It's why they were so unremittingly and relentlessly hostile to the Soviet Union. It was because, for whatever else it was and whatever faults it might have had, the Soviet economy had actually eliminated capitalist commodity production. It was held back by a whole series of other bureaucratic deformations, but it wasn't a capitalist state. It was a whole area of the world that was sealed off to capitalism. And of course, the more anti-colonial revolutions took place that were inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, the more areas of the world were potentially sealed off. This is a dire threat to capitalism, which the lead capitalist nation, of course, took an energetic and brutal response in making sure that they crushed this completely. And when, of course, the Soviet Union disappeared under the weight of its internal contradictions in 1991, the Americans then sought to capitalize, as I was saying earlier. And so any barrier cannot be tolerated, even if the Russian capitalist class are willing to bargain with the Americans and want to actually reach a deal on the basis of an arrangement between two capitalist powers. That's not enough. It has to be complete submission. It has to be complete subservience to the US ruling class. Otherwise, it is not acceptable. And that reflects their need to rapaciously conquer new markets, to be able to exploit resources anywhere, to be able to move money anywhere, to not have anything stand in their way. And that need of capitalism at its base, that need of the imperialist system at its base, becomes manifested through the policy structures of the state. And so you get things like the neocon project, which is often, neocons are often cited as this thing which is a unique clique. But no, they're just a manifestation, a reflection of a need in the economic base of the United States, a need inherent within imperialist nations for no restrictions on their ability to exploit anywhere in the world, which is why even as they're doing all this trade with China, they're trying to ring China with bases. Even as they're preaching a new doctrine of friendship with Russia in the 90s, they're looking to move in to various different ex-Soviet states to secure a military advantage over the Russian Federation. And these are the contradictions that power the events in Ukraine, and the continued refusal of the United States government to actually take anything the Russians say seriously, or if not take seriously, then at least take a pause in their actions. The actions of the Russians in Syria be running a very effective campaign that destroyed a lot of the US proxies and restored the power of the Syrian central state under President Assad, should have given them a reflection on the fact that the Russian forces had obviously improved a great deal, even from their performance in the war against another CIA guy, Mikhail Saakashvili, president of Georgia back in 2008. And I'll be jumping to the Georgia thing in a moment. But it should have given them pause, but it didn't. It just made them more and more mad, it seems. Now, the Georgia war is interesting because it's an almost exact replica, but of course the Ukraine is on a bigger scale. The same thing happening. The Americans, through a color revolution, get rid of the former Soviet foreign minister, actually, Eduard Shevardnadze. This guy comes in This guy Mikhail Saakashvili comes in. He's supposed to be the great reformer, the great beneficiary of a color revolution. Of course, he's a hack CIA guy. He's some crazy, like ultra nationalist guy. He's a character straight out of like the National Endowment for Democracy's central casting. He's too unstable, really, even for the CIA to handle. He's too much of a crazy bastard, even for them, because he wasn't meant to provoke a war with the Russians in 2008. He was meant to be a running source of instability for the Russians, which is also what they meant Ukraine to be. He's not meant to go for a full-on war. He ends up provoking one in South Ossetia, loses badly. The Russians take that territory, recognize the independent state, and Saakashvili ends up eating his tie on screen. Look it up on YouTube if you don't believe me. He's currently back on trial in Georgia for various crimes, and the fact that the Americans learned nothing from that tells you that these people are incapable. That's the old phrase: learnt nothing and forgotten everything. But the turnaround in Ukraine, the fact that they went from being what was already an unstable and ill-developed and oligarchically run country, everything that the Americans did, acting through their proxies in the Ukrainian fascistic movement, everything they did made the situation worse, because Ukraine since 2014 has only gotten poorer. There's been vast outflows of skilled and unskilled labor from Ukraine to the neighboring states. Migration has went to an all-time high. People were looking to get out. It became more unstable. Of course, you've got the two. There's what has been an 8-year war in the east, with all the instability that brings, and the Ukrainian armed forces being unable to reconquer those territories against the again in Donetsk and Luhansk. And of course, reason why they can't reconquer it is because the Ukrainian state no longer had any reliable armed forces, because the Ukrainian state was completely hollowed out. And if you look at again, I mentioned before, the World Bank, IMF plans, etc., for Ukraine's economy, it's very open about this. It's full-on looting of the most valuable sections of farmland, final destruction of state-owned enterprises, full-on brutal war against the living standards of the Ukrainian working class is what the World Bank was prescribing, which is what they always prescribe. They're an American entity. It's what they do. And so the coup regime, because it's not just the presidents, Poroshenko and Zelensky, again, they both were elected. People voted for them thinking they were going to reach some kind of arrangement with the Russians, end the war in the East, reunite the country to some degree. The fact that what happened was that they signed the Minsk Accords, which would have ended the conflict. It would have given autonomy to the two predominantly Russian-speaking regions in the East. It would have ended the conflict. It was signed by, I believe, Poroshenko. It was negotiated and approved by the UN Security Council. But of course, Ukraine, either under Poroshenko and under Zelensky, never implemented it. And the Germans, the French, and certainly the Americans didn't push them to implement it. The Americans were pushing in the opposite direction. Because what did the Americans ultimately see in Ukraine? Was it a payday for Joe Biden? Well, partly through his own corrupt practices. Was it a chance to loot this nation like they'd looted so many others? Well, yes, partly. But I think the overall prize in Ukraine was the fact, the ability they had to use it as a constant source of instability to affect Russia proper, and to have it as a constant source of instability on Russia's border, to carry the threat of NATO membership, even and NATO troops being deployed to Russia's border, even if Ukraine never actually joined. And they kept playing this game, the Americans, for years and years and years, whereby they knew very well that having Ukraine in NATO would create problems for them, but they dangled it out there as a prize before the Ukrainian oligarchy that they might be able to achieve one day, just as they dangle it in front of the Georgian oligarchy. And they want to keep this situation in eastern Ukraine simmering away like a boiling pan of water, and they want to keep it on the boil but not boiling over. They want to use it as a source of constant instability and to launch destabilization operations maybe into Russia itself. Ultimately, the aim of some of these people, some of the madder end of them, is that they're going to do some sort of regime change operation against Putin himself. Certainly, they had Alexei Navalny in mind for that, but I think they drastically overestimated his popularity. Putin himself still has a degree of popularity inside Ukraine because, of course, no, not Ukraine, Russia itself, because, again, he's seen as the guy who came in and stabilized an unstable situation, took some action against the most egregious examples of the oligarchy, locked up people like Khodorkovsky, people like that. So still has a degree of popularity, even if that popularity is probably overstated. What the American policymakers have aimed to do is just to keep Ukraine as a source of constant instability, as an asset for them to deploy against Russia. And they were not keen to see that conflict resolved. And I'll emphasize this, that even as late as 2 weeks ago, maybe, if they'd have actually implemented the Minsk Accords, given autonomy to those regions in the east, of course, ended the war, and returned those two regions could have potentially been returned into Ukraine with a heavy degree of autonomy. Certainly the Russians approved of that process, and Putin and Lavrov both said publicly that that was what they saw as resolving the problem. But of course, again, I said when we were talking, I was talking about the fate of Kosovo and Serbia. The Russians haven't forgotten all of that. And so now that they are in a position where they felt like they could push further, seeing the fact that the US government was weakening, that its economy was weakening, that its military capabilities had been severely downgraded from what they were 20 years ago, thanks to the US pursuing 20 years of war. And I'll quote Scott Ritter on this, which is firing rockets into the huts of goat herders. Seeing as all of that was in play, the Russians felt like now was the time that they were going to get this addressed. Some of their frustrations and grievances from the previous 20 years address. And if you read the draft proposals that they sent to NATO before Christmas, to bringing up a lot of stuff in there about all expansions of NATO post 1997. Now, of course, I don't think the Russians expected for a moment that NATO membership would be revoked from places like Poland, but they put everything in there that was on the grievance list. And the Americans came back and dismissed most of it. They said they were prepared to talk about arms control, but they weren't prepared to actually do what was necessary, which is tell the Kiev regime that they had to implement the Minsk Accords and end the war, because that's not in the interests of the US government. Their interest is in maintaining the war, maintaining the instability in the East. So in the end, what Putin and the Russian government and the wider Russian ruling class left with a situation where they know that the Americans are going to continue fucking around in Ukraine, even if it doesn't join NATO, which I don't think it was actually going to. I don't think it would have been something the Americans would actually do. They wanted just to keep it as a source of instability and to keep the NATO membership there as both a threat and a promise. But in the end, there were Putin, and it's not just him, of course, there's a much wider circle of people involved in this, chose to ultimately take military action, go to war over it. I myself said that I thought it was unlikely that they would actually come to war, that some compromise would be found. But eventually, the ruling class press in Britain even started talking about, well, maybe it's time to implement the Minsk Accords. But by then, the pressure on Putin himself to act had probably grown too great within the councils of the Russian state itself. This is one of the most ridiculous things that the press always does. They focus just on the figure of Putin as some sort of mystical figure, halfway between Rasputin and Ivan the Terrible and Stalin. Ultimately, Putin is a representative of a much wider layer within the Russian state, who are, by ideological terms, you'd call them bourgeois Russian nationalists. If you listen to Putin's two speeches of the last week, that's obviously where he stands. He is a reactionary in that sense. And he made that very clear when he denounces the Bolshevik Revolution. He denounces the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that ended it. He denounces the changes to the territorial borderlands of Ukraine in the 1920s. He's clever enough to adopt some of the more heroic symbols of the Soviet period, for instance, the victory over Nazism and the Great Patriotic War. But he's an anti-communist. He's a representative of the Russian capitalist class. And he makes that very clear in his speeches. This isn't some kind of Soviet Union 2.0 revanchist thing going on here. I mean, it would be ridiculous to say that it is. Like, this is a guy who's representing the Russian capitalist class, which is by no means strong enough to challenge the Americans on a global basis, but is now powerful enough to assert its interests in what it regards as its region. And the Americans' failure to pay heed to that is what's behind these moves this week. And it's worth emphasizing again, the Americans could have solved it at any point by simply pulling the plug on the ultras in Kiev and telling them, no, this is over, you've got to sign that. But again, they don't want to. Why? Well, for the reasons I've outlined about the nature of imperialism, but also in the nature of the American capitalist state itself. Nature of the American state is that it is, of course, as all states are, reflective of the state of the class struggle inside the American nation itself, but also the state of the sort of alignment of forces amongst the bourgeoisie. And within the American state structure, there is what I'll use Marx's old term when he was referring to Napoleon III of France. There is a militarist clique that runs much of the American federal government state structure. Call them, if you like, use Eisenhower's old phrase, military industrial complex. It's a selection of the permanent bureaucracy, the military hierarchy, the intelligence men, their links into the commercial world and the arms manufacturers, maybe some elements of the fossil fuel companies as well, oil companies, etc. But this forms a solid militarist layer within the American state, which always pushes for the most belligerent action possible. And they have their political representatives in both parties. There's no real difference there, of course. Hillary Clinton was their chosen representative when they pushed in Libya, which, of course, Obama later claimed that he wasn't really in favor of, and maybe he's telling the truth about that. But certainly the militarist clique in Washington was, and Obama was never one to buck the trend there. Whenever powerful interest groups within the American ruling class or the American state machine made demands, he was always very careful to accommodate them, which is why he gave them their war in Libya, why he gave them their war in Syria. Probably not what he would have done left to his own devices, but no American president is left to their own devices. And of course, these people have a complete freak out over Trump because, again, for a variety of reasons to do with again, go back to the problems of imperialism itself, but also the way in which this militarist clique is structured. It has a lot of interests in maintaining, as again, Scott Ritter and other people like Douglas McGregor have said, and these are certainly in McGregor's case, that's a guy of the sort of the American nationalist right by his politics, said that the people in the hierarchy of the military, the Pentagon bureaucracy, these people are all dedicated towards maintaining the fantasy that they're going to fight a land war against the 1980 period Soviet Red Army. And because that's big money. And if you read books by, I think it was by one of the Coburns, more recently on Pentagon spending. He outlines just how corrupt this process is, how much money is sloshing around, how much of American defense projects are just based on simply claiming as much money as possible for something and making profits. Now, this isn't the guiding principle of American empire, but it certainly feeds into it. And all of these people are the source of the one of the sources anyway of the unending hostility towards Russia, because it's in this layer's interest to maintain that hostility, backing up, of course, the wider point about imperialism abhorring any barrier. And it's from this layer that the most militant and enraged and unhinged, quite frankly, anti-Russian pronouncements came, specifically when Trump became president, and Trump representing a slight deviation from the norm in that he saw, well, first of all, he saw the future in more, shall we say, vigorous or potentially violent confrontation with the Chinese. But Trump's instinct was to essentially pull the plug on NATO. That's what he was talking about in his 2016 campaign, usually going around saying, we get such a bad deal out of NATO, folks. We're paying for Germany. Why are we paying for Germany? Of course, Trump expressed it in his own way, but of course he was tapping into a contradiction there, which is that NATO essentially had no purpose after 1991, other than as a sort of, other than as a vehicle for American militarist ambitions. Trump seeing the priority not in competition, not in sort of great power competition with Russia, which of course is far below the United States in sort of economic capabilities, as it's been said many times this weekend accurately. Its economy is more on the size of a country like Italy. But the fact that there had been barriers put in the way of the American ruling class, the fact that the Russian state wasn't prepared to just buckle to them, and the fantasies of this militarist clique about maintaining this idea that they were going to go to war with something akin to the Russian army or the Soviet army of the early 80s. All of this sort of keeps the purpose of NATO alive. So when Trump comes in and says, no, we're going to focus on the East, all these people see, well, some of them see the end of American full spectrum dominance on the horizon. And in some ways, Trump, in his own way, was a sort of recognition of the fact that American power had been shown to be increasingly limited. And so Trump was about retrenching and focusing just on one area. And that's why he wanted to get out of the Middle East and he wanted to get out of Europe. And of course, he didn't have the tools available to him to do so. He didn't have the political skill to overcome the entrenched bureaucratic resistance. He didn't have the political base necessary for him to actually counterbalance what was essentially a slow motion coup waged against him by this faction of the American state, personified in the people like John Brennan and the intelligence men who were essentially running a public soft coup against him in the form of Russiagate for many, many years. But the fact that they all freaked over that, again, though, is a sign of weakness. Trump's election was a sign of the fact that the American attempt at maintaining themselves in a new American century, the American ruling class's idea that they were going to maintain this hegemonic status well into the 21st century, had run into the rocks completely. They had been unable to suppress Afghanistan. They had been unable to fully suppress Iraq for all the death and misery that they caused. They can't field gigantic armies of men because the American state's legitimacy and the American state's ability to call upon the loyalty of the American population for wars far overseas that the American working class, even the most uber patriotic of them, can't see the point in, and think are just ways for other people richer than them to make even more money. That is a significant problem, and it became an even bigger problem when it became obvious that the American state couldn't wield these huge armies anymore. It couldn't field armies of the size that it sent into Korea and Vietnam. It couldn't come because of the increasing crisis of legitimacy of its institutions, because it had waged a vicious class war on the American working class for many, many years. All of this feeds into the fact that they thought they could. There were domestic and foreign constraints on them. And of course, this sends many of them even more mad. And they took that out against Trump's attempts to cut deals to reorient America. It's also interesting to note, by the way, in passing, that the Obama administration did almost agree with Trump on something, which Obama, through Trans-Pacific Partnership, was trying to reorient the American state machine towards strategic competition, as they would put it, with the Chinese in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, Trump's idea was that he was going to get American capital to come back into the United States somehow. Ultimately, he was never going to be able to get that. His success in that was very, very limited, and he had to throw an awful lot of federal, state, and local funding at Foxconn, I believe, to open up a factory in Wisconsin. But the point is that both Obama and Trump recognized in their own ways that things were going to, that the main actual economic competition was, from their perspective, with the Chinese. Now, Trump sank TPP, and hilariously so, and of course sank Hillary Clinton along with it. But of course, Trump was blocked at every turn from trying to disengage in other long-standing conflicts. And again, like, he didn't have the tools at his disposal to overcome that opposition quite a lot of the time. But even Biden, trying to withdraw from Afghanistan, ran into this, of course. Not that he was, again, they saw it through, but they oversaw a completely disastrous, chaotic withdrawal, which now, of course, the Republicans are running with the idea that Biden's weakness expressed during that encouraged Putin to act. But of course, that's not, maybe a part of it, but it's certainly not the whole picture. But the reason why I go into this slight digression about the Trump era is because you have to understand that the Trump era represents what is going to be an increasingly large theme of American politics going forward, which is that the American empire is dying on its feet. The dream of a new American century, the dream of full spectrum dominance, withered away with their failures in the Middle East, and now it is withering away because even quicker, which is why they're getting so hysterical, because they will not do anything to stop the Russians in Ukraine. They've already said that they're not going to deploy American troops, and certainly Boris Johnson's not going to deploy what little troops he has into Ukraine. And as others have pointed out elsewhere, if they actually wanted to send a signal to the Russians that that they shouldn't invade, they could have put even a limited number of troops in Kiev or some other strategically important location, but they didn't, because to them, Ukraine has served its purpose. If they lose it, if the Russians take the eastern regions, or even if they took the whole thing, which is unlikely, the Americans wouldn't. The Americans would regret that they looked bad. They do what they're doing at the moment, throwing a load of sanctions on Russia, but they wouldn't make any military moves. And if you look at the statements of Biden and Johnson and the ridiculous idiot Keir Starmer and Olaf Scholz, it's all about, we will protect our NATO allies. We're going to send troops to Romania, to the Baltic states, to Poland, to Hungary, anywhere else but Ukraine. And it would be screamingly obvious to anybody who isn't Volodymyr Zelensky or isn't like the Azov battalion leaders, the Americans had no intention of backing them up if the Russians moved, because why would they? They've got a good amount of loot out of Ukraine. They would have preferred to sustain the destabilization operations they were running there against Russia. But if it's gone, it's gone. They'll find some other way to fuck around. And the inability of the Ukrainian leaders to recognize this is going to be, well, I think they'll recognize it pretty damn quick, given that all the Americans managed to, and the Europeans managed to agree today with sanctions, but with a whole list of exemptions. Because, as now, and as others have said, the German ruling class has far more interest in trading with Russia than they do of engaging in some kind of war with them. There's an awful lot of trade between Russia and Germany, not just over the potential for Nord Stream 2, but already over energy, over machine tools, over a lot of German manufacturers going one way and Russian resources coming another. You get the Belgians asking for an exemption on the sanctions for Russian diamonds. You get the Italians asking for the same thing. You get the British Parliament now, an absolute ship of fools, if ever there was one, honking and bellowing all day about standing up for Ukraine, standing up for democracy. And then it's, you know, it's the opposite of talk loudly and talk softly, speak softly and carry a big stick. It's scream at the top of your voice and carry around nothing. Because even with all the screaming and the yelling from people like Keir Starmer, what it amounts to is we'll put some sanctions on you, which if you read, there was a recent article in the Financial Times which seemed to have good information in it about the fact that the Russians have been moving their economy away from too much dependence upon the British, the Americans, and the Europeans, and sort of sanctions proofing it. They have the relationship with China, Iran, and other, you know, uber sanctioned nations. They can sell their energy to the Chinese and other countries. Again, like the sanctions regime will hurt them, but not by much than it has already. And the reason why you're getting this screaming madness coming out of the British Parliament, coming out of the Democratic and the Republican parties in the United States, is because it's all cover. It's all cover for the fact that essentially they are impotent here, and they don't want to do anything. They won't do anything. They didn't do anything for Mikhail Saakashvili in 2008, and they're not going to do anything for Volodymyr Zelensky now. If the Azov battalion all gets wiped out by the Russians, so be it. They'll find other proxies to deal with. The Americans and the British always dispose of their proxies when it gets too inconvenient for them, when it gets too costly. There's a long list of South American strongmen, caudillos, that could testify to the fact that the loyalty of the Americans is always very slight. And when a better offer comes along or it gets too costly, quite happy to dispose of you. As the Ukrainian fascists will find out very quickly. If it's too costly, the Americans are not there for you. They've made their money, they've used you up, and they're on their way. And now you're left basically holding your dick, facing a Russian invasion. Now, as to whether Putin will actually take all of Ukraine or not, I mean, I'm not going to speculate on it. Certainly, what seems to be the intention that he has in mind is that they're going to take, shall we say, secure control over the Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, maybe take some more of eastern Ukrainian territory to secure those areas more, but probably not securing the whole country. What they seem to want to do is secure basically if Zelensky won't commit, they'll find somebody else. Having destroyed the American proxies, they'll find somebody else like perhaps Poroshenko, who's made a lot of anti-Russian speeches recently, but has had a lot of dealings with the Kremlin in the past. Maybe they'll find somebody else from the oligarchy who's willing to step in and commit to Ukrainian neutrality. That seems to be their plan. Taking the whole thing, they could do it. Maybe they could even hold it. But is Russian capitalism capable of not just taking, but securing and integrating Ukraine into the wider Russian state? That's an open question. I suspect they won't want to go for the whole thing, also because the Western Ukrainian regions are the regions most likely to be a running sore, and the regions that the US is most likely to try and get some kind of organized insurgency going against them. Again, I could be proved wrong tomorrow. Events are moving very quickly. But I suspect it'll be the eastern regions that they secure, and they will leave it at that, having made their point, having made the Americans and British look very silly, having destroyed the proxy forces of the Americans inside Ukraine itself, and they may well leave it there, having secured their objectives. And perhaps the Americans will be content to actually leave it at that as well. Shout about more sanctions, and then certainly the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Belgians, maybe even the British ruling class themselves will be happy to go back to business as usual within a few months, or maybe within a year or two. Certainly what's been revealed is the fact that there's no appetite within the ruling classes of the major countries of Europe for war with Russia. Why would there be? It would be an absolutely heinous, suicidal act for them to engage in. Again, don't rule it out completely, because it was a suicidal thing for the ruling classes of Europe to do World War One. Ultimately, almost wiped out capitalism itself in the aftermath of it. So again, war is created under capitalism because the contradictions in the system build up to such a degree that it is only through war itself that these contradictions can be resolved, either internally or externally or both. But once it starts, it's very difficult to stop. And even with skilled statesmen at the helm, it'd be difficult to stop. Never mind with the likes of Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, the complete no mark in Berlin, Olaf Scholz, all of whom make even, the pipsqueak Macron look like some sort of genius. But to move now to the question of the various responses around the world from leftists, etc. We've seen the odious creature known as Paul Mason doing his bad cover version of Christopher Hitchens down in Kiev. Him and the old rat John McDonnell are running a supposedly anti-war demonstration focused on demands against the Russian government, which is a novel approach, given that we're not in Russia. I don't know if John and Paul know this. I know that neither of these guys are exactly Leninists, but you should always look at it in this way, which is that the situation in Ukraine could have been resolved if the British and the American governments had actually been prepared to see the implementation of the Minsk agreements. As I said earlier, they chose not to. They chose to have Ukraine as a running source of instability. And it is the actions of our government which we must tackle. Now, you can say X, Y, and Z. Putin runs a capitalist regime. True. Putin's a bourgeois nationalist. Also true. And he is, and of course, the representative of the Russian capitalist class. And the Russian capitalist class is the enemy of the Russian working class. How could it be otherwise? But me and others in Britain, our responsibility is not towards what happens in Moscow. Our responsibility is towards what happens in London. What is the policy of the imperialist government in London? If you're in the United States, your primary responsibility is towards the American government and its actions. It's like we can have far more of a realistic proposition of exercising some kind of influence through protest over our own domestic governments than we can over anybody else. And it is the primary responsibility of the British and the Americans that the situation has unfolded like it has. And I know that currently there'll be people on the internet screaming all day about Putin aggression, stand up to him, all these impotent, flailing Daily Mail columnists and Guardian columnists as well, the entire bourgeois media bellowing and howling, people who would run a mile if they had heard a car backfire. Yet they're all tough guys on their TV shows. The nature of the Russian government, the nature of the regime that runs inside Russia, or indeed any other country, is the business of the working class of that country. Our business is with the government of Boris Johnson here and holding them to account, restraining them in whatever way we can over their warmongering, their violations of every single treaty they ever signed, their constantly engaging in intrigues overseas, which inevitably rebound back to us in the end, as we saw tragically with the actions of the Manchester bomber of course, who came out of the war in Libya, fought for Britain in Libya, then came home and carried out a bombing just up the road from where I'm talking to you now. And the inability of many people on the left to actually understand that the real enemy is the domestic ruling class. It's always the only case where you can make where the enemy is not the domestic ruling class is when you're subject to foreign invasion, which we're not. Vladimir Putin and the Russians aren't rolling the tanks up the Mall in London and parking a T-72 or something in Buckingham Palace. Would be kind of amusing maybe, but they're not, nor are they ever likely to. It is our government which has created the situation. And in times of national defense, there's an argument for rallying round in a war of national defense, but that's not what we're in. No, it's not what we're in at all. We're in an imperialist country which is acting in a way to actually exacerbate tensions with a nuclear armed power. Our aim should be to restrain that if we can, or at the very least, make our opposition plain. mobilize around it if we possibly can, in a way that would have at least draw in people from the working class who want to actually express their discontent, who actually want to learn more about capitalism and imperialism, not to echo the talking points of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and go and hold a fucking demo outside the Russian embassy. And it's like, doing that, you are just a tool of imperialism. I don't care what you fucking call yourself. Like, our enemy is at home. Lenin was right about that. Now we go into a period where American hegemony is visibly damaged. It is a visibly decaying empire. It is going to have more and more political divisions within it between those who want to focus on China, the sort of holdouts who have got a mad obsession with Russia, and those in the sort of American nationalist circles that do exist out there who want to retrench inside the borders of the United States itself. All of these divisions are going to play out and weaken the ability of the American empire to project itself overseas, an ability which is already severely compromised, and is getting more compromised the more time marches on. And when the Russians conclude their operation inside Ukraine, and I think retreat their forces to the eastern side, the Americans will be left looking much weaker. And that's going to produce a whole new range of contradictions, which anybody who's serious about building working class power in the United States should be responding to, not echoing the fucking dribbling maniacs in the State Department banging on about Russian aggression, stuff like that. You've got to deal with the realities, the class realities of your own country, which is true of Britain as well. We're careering into what I would have called repeatedly the renewal of the recession of 2008. And which, again, series of issues that were never solved. They just threw money at it and let loads of zombie firms continue staggering around staggering around the economic landscape over here, and risking a contagion and collapse effect when the recession does come, which it will. I can't tell you exactly when, but all the signs are there: low and stagnant growth, increasing rates of inflation, gigantic amounts of debt in the system. There are more dollars been created than an entire world's produce of goods and services could ever buy. One of the big reasons why the American state actually continues to belligerently stagger around the world, trying to assert itself everywhere, is because so much of their power is based upon the role of the dollar as the international reserve currency. And without confidence in that dollar, well, their power diminishes very, very quickly. And you build it and you have confidence you restore market confidence by doing things like engaging in belligerent acts, making sure that everybody out there knows that the capitalist class in the United States can ultimately and reliably call upon the vicious armed force of the American state to enforce their claims everywhere. But of course, when that confidence goes, and in a position where American capitalism is already severely decayed, then they have some severe problems and some severe contradictions that they are not equipped to handle. You're going to see huge attacks on the American and the British working class in the next period. We should be building towards working class resistance of those attacks. Anybody who's not interested in doing that, but interested in posturing about what's going on inside, what's going on inside Russia, isn't a serious person. As it's been pointed out in the chat that no communist parties are serious in the USA. None of the official ones that I can see. I know of individual communists and certain projects that are more serious. A question I'll come to now, a question that was asked of me by EJ on Twitter today regarding, is Russia's of the or invasion or security operation inside Ukraine an imperialist action? Now, various articles written about this. Some people claim, of course, it's an inherently anti-imperialist action because it's directed against the primary imperialist power, which is the United States. And Russia isn't an imperialist power by any stretch of the imagination. And there's an article that was sent to me, which was outlining that Russian capitalism didn't meet the criteria for imperialism. Now, what I'd say to that is this: the weakness of Russian capitalism and the comparatively puny nature of it when compared to the United States or compared to Germany or even the lesser powers like France or Britain, is obvious. It's not. It doesn't have the same level of economic potential at the moment as the Americans or any of the other leading capitalist nations do. Again, its economy is on the same level as Italy. Really, what the Russian capitalist class have done through 30 years of counter-revolution and looting is that they've essentially returned themselves to the almost the sort of comparable position to that they were under the Tsar, which is that they are a lesser capitalist power. Both some of them may have ambitions towards wider, shall we say, adventures in the future as American power declines, but at the moment they are a large regional power that is trying to assert itself around what it considers to be its regional interests. Now, you can say that that's reactionary, you can say that it's capitalist, but it's not an imperialist state in the same way that the Germans or the French or the British or the Americans are. It's nowhere near that level. Of course, it is a reactionary it is led by a reactionary government. Of course it is. But to try and put it on the same level as the United States is not correct. Nor, in my view, is it correct to view, it's not correct when the idiots and the bourgeoisie regard Putin as some sort of restoration of the Soviet Union. Again, he's the leader of the Russian capitalist class. Nor is it correct when some leftists try and do that either. Let's just look at this for what it is. You can argue that this is a lesser power trying to defend itself against a much more powerful state. But you can't be arguing that this is like some sort of restoration of Soviet socialism. It just isn't. It's the Russian capitalist class defending interests in what it regards as its backyard, its own version of the Monroe Doctrine, if you will. You can also make the argument that there is the right to self-determination of these Russian-speaking regions in eastern Ukraine. Certainly, there is that right. Certainly, these are people who have faced repression from the fascistic regime in the supported by the Americans. But again, like they have the right to self-determination, and they have the right to live free of the fear of persecution. Everybody does. Everybody should have. But is the working class in Donetsk and Lugansk going to get a better deal in the medium to long term from the Russian capitalist class? I would suspect it might be more stable, but it'll be still an exploitative relationship. Of course it will. So let's just be clear what we are dealing with here. Wanting to see the recreation of the Soviet Union, whether you are a Marxist or whether you are a bourgeois, doesn't mean to say that it is true. You know, it's not like that old Simpsons bit where Russia kicks over the table and reveals that they've been the Soviet Union all along and they've just lulled the United States into a false sense of security. Be clear about what you're dealing with, you know? Be clear about the fact that in Putin's case, the principal opposition to him, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, would have actually launched this operation a lot earlier. So when Americans say the opposition party should take to the streets, it's like, no, the opposition party in this case is actually more militantly in favor of occupation of those areas than Putin was. As I said, Putin is a cautious leader. And he's a cautious leader because he's very aware of the weaknesses of the capitalist state that he leads. They have a powerful military, a much more powerful military than their economic performance would suggest, and certainly one that is capable of, more than capable of, kicking around most of the NATO armies, which have very much diminished these days. But again, this is a cautious man, Putin. He's probably going to withdraw away from Kiev and Western Ukraine when they've finished getting their objectives. So I hope I've made some of that clear at least. I'm obviously happy to go into more detail on future streams. I'm aware that I've been speaking almost continuously for 90 minutes. I have a tendency to do that. So are there any questions in the chat that we can let's just take a look through. Yes, we've already dealt with Crystal and Saga prostrating themselves before the State Department. Shadowbound refugees. I don't believe Ukraine is Russian territory, but I don't believe Ukraine is Ukrainian territory either. I think this is. Oh yeah, let's go as autonomous. We must prefer autonomous regions. I'm all about that free association. This is a genuine anarchist in the chat, and go and watch the discussion I had with him on Franco's show a few days ago. Very interesting discussion there. Good to see you back. Hello, Tony. No communist parties are serious in the USA. Well, the CPUSA certainly isn't serious, Harley. None of the rest of them, stuff like idiots like the PSL, who spent the last few weeks calling the Canadian truckers' protest horrifically racist. None of these people are remotely serious. The same is true for certainly the communist parties in most countries now, with a few exceptions. Greek Communist Party is still a serious organization, no matter what you think of its actual political line. Some of the Turkish communists are still serious organizations. If you want more about that, I would suggest going to the In Defense of Communism website and checking out some of their articles. What do I make of Klaus Schwab naming Putin as one of the young global leaders? I take it this was a while ago. I mean, Putin, let's go back. I said earlier, there's a question from Tony. Look, Putin was a favored guy in the West. He was favored by Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, many others early on, because they thought he was going to be a sober Yeltsin. So if he turned up at like some World Economic Forum meetings and got a pat on the head from creepy Klaus, well, that's not a surprise. They thought he was, the capitalists in the West thought he was going to be a good investment. They failed to understand the fact that once Russian capitalism got on its feet again and was capable of actually asserting its interest, that they would run into problems. Some of them sort of understood it, which is why they kept fucking around in Chechnya. But many of them thought that they were just getting a compliant stooge. I mean, Putin's many things, but he's not a compliant stooge for them. Question: what would be an anti-imperialist internationalist position in today's day? That's from Je Suis Peanuts. Well, I would say this: to draw on what I was saying earlier, when it comes to this situation, as it did when we came to issues like Libya and Ukraine, the first and most important thing to do if you're in an imperialist country, which I take it our questioner that you are, is to do what I was talking about earlier, which is you have to take the point of view. The real enemy in our case is at home. The real enemy in our case of Britain is a reactionary imperialist British government, no matter who heads it, whether it's Boris Johnson, his replacement, whoever that is, or Keir Starmer, or back in the past, Tony Blair, or further in the past, any of the other Labour prime ministers. The real enemy is at home. They're the ones who are exploiting the British working class. They're the ones that are creating these problems around the world with aggressive imperialist actions. That has to be our starting point. And then when you get and this is why I also have a problem with the sort of the pacifist middle class politics of the likes of Stop the War, although I would always stand with them against attacks by the likes of the Tory party and Keir Starmer, is that it opens them up for the emotional blackmail that you get when I think the Russian American journalist Yasha Levine has a good line on this. He says that the Americans and others, of course, like the British, specialized in the weaponized immigrants. And he writes very interestingly on that subject with regard to his own family's experience and how the American state weaponizes groups of emigres from places like the old Soviet Union and uses them politically to support their imperialist campaigns by mobilizing them inside the United States and Britain itself. So this happened a few years ago with Stop the War, when we got a bunch of Syrian exiles turning up, accusing them of backing Assad, and they had a freak out over it. Stop the War took a sort of very shaky position on Libya and Syria, whereas what should have been done, and I was part of a Trotskyist group at the time that didn't do this, is to point out, no, this is imperialist aggression. No matter what you think of the nature of the Gaddafi government or the Assad government, or even back in the day, the old Saddam Hussein government, whatever they are is better than whatever foul collection of reactionaries that the Americans and the British or the French or the Germans want to put in there. So it's not even a controversial thing now to say that Gaddafi is better than the mess of jihadists and open slave markets that came after him, or that whatever you think of Syrian Baathism, It's better than the collection of head-chopping maniacs that the US would have happily put in charge there. Again, like, you have to take the point of view that the main enemy is at home. The main enemy wants to not only have the right to exploit the working class domestically, but to send them overseas to potentially die in horrific wars. Thankfully, they are constrained in doing that because of the level of opposition these wars would generate. But they're still out there doing it. So you have to be absolutely uncompromising when it comes to that. When it comes to the question of like, oh, well, what about the fact that the war might be unpopular in Russia? What about what if the Russian working class moves against Putin and all that kind of thing? Well, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. The actions of the Russian working class will be their own. We can't dictate to them from here. Again, one of the biggest mistakes and pieces of pathetic egotism that the British left's been guilty of for many years is these are people with almost zero influence inside the working class of their own country, and yet they seek to, behind the veil of so-called solidarity, try and dictate to other working class movements across the world. No, let's wind our fucking necks in here, guys. Let's face facts. Like Marxist, socialist, communist groups, even anarchist groups have no real influence inside the British working class now. Why is that? It's because the working class has been on a political fight for a number of years, and the politicization level in society as a whole has gone right down. Atomization has gone right down. Alienation reigns supreme. The union movement is fucking decimated. All those things is what we should be focusing on. Again, the struggle starts at home. Okay, what do you think will happen to the existing Ukrainian oligarchy? If it's got any brains, Oz whistles, it'll cut a deal. I mean, these people, a lot of these people have no principles whatsoever. It's all about interests. If they've got any brains, they'll cut a deal with the Russians, withdraw the NATO membership claim, and try and maintain a neutral stance. Whether they can or not is another question. Whether they have the wherewithal to withstand whatever temptation the Americans dangle in front of them next is another question. Maybe faced with physical annihilation, they'll concentrate the minds. But if they've got any sense, they'll cut a deal. Many of them will flee. Those who are most associated with the Maidan regime will pack as much money as possible, and the president did, and flee the country in whatever means is available to them. Well, they're probably turning up in a suburb near you. If you live in Washington, D.C., for instance, or London. So they're going to cut and run. Many of them will cut and run. Those that remain, maybe with connections to Russia, will try and cut some sort of deal. They would be well advised to take the neutrality option. Otherwise, they're just going to keep getting used by the US as this hideous game they're playing. Lavitz Lawrence asks, with NATO seeming weak with this Ukraine conflict, is that enough to change the US ruling class interest in the region, or are the material interests in destabilizing Russia too strong? Good question. The war lobby, the lobby for regime change in Russia inside the militarist clique in Washington is very strong. Whether that can survive a coming recession and the demonstration of NATO impotence and division that has come across throughout this crisis is another question. Whether it can survive the political turnover that's going to happen in Washington when the Democrats lose miserably to the GOP in the midterms, whether it can survive the destruction of the Biden presidency, which will happen either through an election or possibly through retirement, through ill health, who knows. But the bigger danger and the bigger area of competition will be between the United States and China. That's a much more serious piece of competition, and the more serious parts of the US ruling class are already looking in that direction. In an ideal world, not an ideal world, but in a more rational world, the Germans and the French would use this as an opportunity to move away from security dependence on the United States. Now, the French got caught out, and Macron ended up looking like a fool, because the French ruling class have become dependent upon, to a certain extent anyway, American military support in West Africa, which is where the French maintain or try and maintain a colonial relationship with their former colonies like Mali, which is trying to keep them out at the moment. And they rely on American military support to a certain extent to maintain their position there, which is why Macron didn't want a war in Europe. He didn't want this war to break out, but he was unable to override the United States because the United States stood strongly behind making promises to the oligarchic clique in Kiev. The French were unable to override that. The Germans have retained a security dependence upon the United States since 1945. And again, Olaf Scholz doesn't seem to be the guy to break with that. Ultimately, though, if this continues and like it keeps getting in the way of like the business that the French and German ruling classes want to do with Russia and stability on the continent, they're going to have to move away. And if the next American administration also chooses to reorientate towards the east, then you are going to see the slow disintegration of NATO. I think it's going to happen. It's just a question of when and like how it happens. Do you see the convoy movements as a potential opportunity to fight the enemy at home? Well, yes. Certainly, like the truckers' convoy in Canada, and I know that there's one started in the United States, are at the very least an opportunity for anybody who's serious about opposing militarism and imperialism to go out and actually speak to the truckers and make a common point of struggle. I mean, I've said on the podcast before, and of course my co-host Layla's been to some of these protests in Ottawa, that the truckers were basing their movement around a clear class demand, which was that they not be subjected to experimental medical treatments from drug companies whose stock, by the way, is now falling rapidly. And this was a gathering of largely working class people, some, of course, owner operators in there as well, with a class-based demand that their work not be endangered if they refuse to take a certain medication, which was unnecessary anyway. So there's a great deal of potential to talk to those people about an anti-imperialist agenda, about fighting the real enemy. And of course, a lot of varied perspectives, a lot of confused perspectives in those trucker demonstrations, but the attitude should have been go and speak with them, go and engage with them, see what their concerns are, and see if you can relate whatever program you have to them. I mean, that's just fucking politics 101. But apparently most communists are now incapable of actually doing that, most basic of things. So yeah, there is of course potential in them. There's also potential, as I said, for it to go off the rails, for it to be captured by dead-ender forces, for it to be captured by forces in like the bourgeois parties of the United States. All of that's in there, but there's potential in it that should have been explored by anybody who's interested in actually putting forward a working class-based politics and putting forward an anti-imperialist politics. Okay, so I've been going for, well, an hour and 50. Unless there's any further questions, I'm going to call it quits there. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'll probably be back with one of these, recording the podcast tomorrow, so I'll probably be back with one of these at least on Saturday. So I'm going to be doing these whilst the current situation goes on, to provide some kind of space for discussion. So thank you to everybody for tuning in. I hope that you've got had an informative time going through this with me. And certainly what I'll do is this will be on the channel. There is going to be a Rockfin channel launched in the near future. Already got the page set up for that, so it's going on there. So only remains for me to say thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Be sure to check out the Red Star Radio podcast if you haven't already. And there's a whole archive in there on various different subjects, a lot of stuff on COVID, of course, a lot of stuff on the American politics, British politics. And be sure to see if you can support the show on the Patreon and listen through to the archive on there. But first of all, go and check out the interview that we did with Scott Ritter, former Marine Corps intelligence officer and one of the chief weapons inspectors to Iraq in the 1990s. He has a lot of very interesting things to say about the military side of things that many of his forecasts are coming true at the moment. So be sure to check that out. But until next time, to be advertised on Twitter, thank you, everybody, and I will speak to you again very soon.